Why does a woman choose to permanently mark her skin? This seemingly simple question hides one of the most disturbing revelations in modern psychology. Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychoanalyst, uncovered dark secrets about the female mind that society prefers to ignore. And tattoos are just the tip of the iceberg. Have you ever stopped to notice how many women around you carry permanent marks on their bodies? Jung discovered that every line of ink under female skin reveals unresolved traumas, suppressed archetypes, and a desperate search for identity that goes far beyond what we imagine. What you're about to discover will shock you. The truth about why women get tattoos connects directly to deep psychological wounds, destructive unconscious patterns, and a psychological reality that challenges everything we thought we knew about female nature. Prepare yourself for a disturbing journey through the most hidden mysteries of the female mind through the lens of Jung's genius. The original wound. Why women seek the pain of the needle. What drives a woman to voluntarily subject herself to hours of physical pain? Jung believed that human behavior is never random, especially when it involves deliberate suffering. When we examine the phenomenon of women seeking tattoo needles, we uncover a psychological pattern that runs much deeper than mere aesthetic choice. Jung's theory of the original wound suggests that every person carries a fundamental psychological injury from early life. For women, this wound often manifests as a disconnection from their authentic self, usually stemming from childhood experiences where they learned their natural expression was unwelcome or dangerous. The tattoo needle becomes a ritualistic return to this original pain, but with one crucial difference. This time, they control it. Consider the contradiction. In a world where women are constantly told to avoid pain, to be comfortable, to seek pleasure, why do millions choose to sit for hours while needles penetrate their skin? Jung would argue this isn't masochism. It's an attempt at psychological integration. The physical pain of tattooing serves as a bridge between the conscious mind, which has learned to suppress difficult emotions, and the unconscious, which holds all the unexpressed trauma. Women often describe the tattooing process as therapeutic or cleansing, without realizing they're engaging in an ancient form of ritualistic healing. Indigenous cultures understood this connection between controlled physical pain and psychological release. Modern women, disconnected from such traditions, unconsciously recreate these rituals in tattoo parlors. The timing of when women get their first tattoos is revealing. Jung observed that major psychological transitions often trigger a need for external symbols of internal change. Many women get their first tattoo during periods of emotional upheaval, after breakups, deaths, career changes, or other life disruptions. The needle becomes a tool for marking the end of one psychological chapter and the beginning of another. But here's where Jung's insight becomes disturbing. The relief women feel from tattoo pain is temporary because it doesn't address the underlying wound. Instead, it creates what psychologists call a trauma bond with the process itself. This explains why most tattooed women don't stop at one. Each subsequent tattoo represents another attempt to reach that unreachable psychological core where the original wound lives. The modern tattoo industry has become a multi-billion-dollar business built largely on women's unconscious need to process pain. Yet nobody talks about the psychological implications. Women are encouraged to see tattoos as empowerment or self-expression, which prevents them from examining the deeper motivations driving their choices. Jung would be fascinated by how modern society has commercialized ancient healing rituals while stripping away their psychological purpose. Women leave tattoo parlors with beautiful artwork but unchanged internal landscapes. The original wound remains untouched, waiting for the next needle, the next temporary relief, the next failed attempt at self-integration through external means. The secret file. When the body becomes a trauma diary. Your body keeps score. And for many women, tattoos become the visible entries in an unconscious trauma diary. Jung understood that the psyche has an irrepressible need to express what cannot be spoken. When words fail, the body becomes the canvas for stories too painful for conscious acknowledgement. Every tattoo tells a story, but rarely the story the woman thinks she's telling. Jung's concept of the personal unconscious explains how traumatic experiences get buried beneath conscious awareness, only to resurface through symbolic expression. Tattoos become hieroglyphs of the unconscious mind, encoding experiences in images and symbols that bypass rational understanding. Watch how women describe their tattoos. They'll tell you about the meaning, a butterfly for transformation, a quote for inspiration, a flower for beauty. But Jung taught us to look beyond the surface narrative to the psychological function. That butterfly might represent a desperate wish to escape a suffocating life situation. The inspirational quote could be a daily reminder trying to convince themselves of something they don't actually believe. The flower might symbolize a femininity they feel they've lost or never possessed. The placement of tattoos on the female body is particularly revealing from a Jungian perspective. Women rarely choose random locations for their ink. Jung believed the body holds psychological significance in every region. Tattoos on the wrist often relate to self-harm impulses or feelings of being trapped. Shoulder tattoos frequently connect to burdens being carried. Lower back tattoos, despite their cultural stigma, often represent hidden sexuality or shame around feminine power. Consider the woman who covers her arms in elaborate sleeve tattoos. Jung would ask, what is she covering? What story is her skin trying to tell through this permanent decoration? Often these extensive tattoos serve as protective armor, creating a barrier between the vulnerable self and the outside world. The artwork becomes a distraction from the person underneath, a way to control what others see and respond to. The sequential nature of most women's tattoo collections reveals the diary aspect clearly. Each new piece represents another chapter in their psychological journey, another attempt to externalize internal experience. Jung observed that repetitive behaviors usually indicate unresolved psychological material-seeking expression. The woman who keeps returning to the tattoo chair isn't just collecting art. She's trying to write herself into existence. Modern psychology has begun to recognize what Jung intuited decades ago. Trauma literally lives in the body. Women who've experienced sexual abuse, emotional neglect, or physical violence often report feeling disconnected from their physical selves. Tattoos become a way of reclaiming bodily autonomy, of making the body theirs again through deliberate marking. But here's the dark truth Jung would have recognized. While tattoos might temporarily restore a sense of control, they can also become another form of self-harm. The addictive quality many women report around tattooing mirrors other compulsive behaviors used to manage psychological pain. The relief is real, but temporary, requiring increasingly frequent sessions to maintain the psychological benefit. The rise of memorial tattoos among women reveals another aspect of this body as diary phenomenon. When women cannot process grief through traditional means, the tattoo needle becomes a ritual of remembrance. Names, dates, symbols of lost loved ones become permanent fixtures on skin that will never heal from their absence. Jung understood that the psyche demands concrete symbols for abstract losses, but he also knew that healthy grief requires integration, not preservation. What makes this particularly concerning is how society celebrates women's tattoos as artistic expression, while ignoring their function as trauma responses. We've created a culture where women's psychological wounds are turned into aesthetic choices, where their pain is praised as creativity, where their unconscious cries for help are admired as body art. The female shadow. What tattoos really hide? Jung's most revolutionary concept was the shadow, that hidden part of personality containing everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. For women, the shadow often holds their authentic power, rage, sexuality, and independence, qualities that society has taught them to suppress. Tattoos become the shadow's secret language, speaking truths the conscious mind won't dare admit. Every woman carries within her a wild, untamed aspect that civilization has forced underground. Jung called this the anima in men and the animus in women, but the female shadow goes deeper. It's the part of her that wants to scream, to fight, to claim space, to be dangerous. Modern society offers women few acceptable outlets for these impulses, so they leak out through permanent ink on skin. The nice girl with the delicate butterfly tattoo might be hiding volcanic rage. The soft-spoken woman with inspirational quotes etched on her ribs could be suppressing a fierce independence that terrifies her. The mother with children's names tattooed on her wrist might be secretly mourning the death of her individual identity. Jung understood that what we display often masks what we most fear to reveal. Consider the phenomenon of women getting tattoos in hidden places, under breasts, on inner thighs, along ribs where clothing conceals them. These aren't for public consumption, they're private communications with the shadow self. The hidden tattoo becomes a secret rebellion, a whispered acknowledgement of the parts of herself she's not allowed to show the world. The shadow doesn't just contain negative qualities, it holds suppressed vitality and creative force. Many women report feeling more like themselves after getting tattooed, not because the tattoo changed them, but because the act of permanently marking their body was their first authentic choice in years. The shadow had finally found a voice, even if that voice spoke only in images and symbols. Jung observed that when the shadow remains unconscious, it tends to possess people, driving compulsive behaviors they can't understand. The woman who impulsively gets a large, prominent tattoo after years of careful conformity might be experiencing shadow possession. Suddenly, the suppressed part of her personality demands recognition, and the tattoo becomes its flag of victory. The dark feminine archetype appears frequently in women's tattoo choices, though they rarely recognize it consciously. Skulls, snakes, ravens, dark roses. These images speak to aspects of feminine power that have been demonized by patriarchal culture. The life-giving woman also holds death-dealing power. The nurturing mother also contains the devouring destroyer. Tattoos allow women to claim these forbidden aspects of their nature safely, through artistic representation rather than direct expression. But here's where Jung's insight becomes crucial. Integrating the shadow requires conscious recognition, not symbolic representation. Getting a tattoo of a fierce wolf doesn't make a woman fierce. It might actually prevent her from developing real fierceness by giving her the illusion she's already claimed that power. The shadow needs to be lived, not just illustrated. The addiction to tattooing often represents an ongoing battle with the shadow. Each new tattoo promises to finally express the inexpressible, to capture the uncapturable essence of who she really is. But the shadow can't be contained in any image, no matter how perfect or meaningful. It requires integration into daily life, conscious acknowledgement, and the courage to live authentically. Society's celebration of women's tattoos as empowerment actually serves to keep the real shadow buried. By applauding the artistic representation of female power, we avoid confronting the reality of women claiming actual power. The tattooed image of strength becomes a substitute for developing real strength. The symbol of independence replaces the messy, difficult work of becoming truly independent. Jung would recognize in modern tattoo culture a profound spiritual crisis. Women are seeking through external means what can only be found through internal work. They're trying to wear their authenticity instead of being authentic. The tattoo becomes both a cry for recognition and a hiding place, simultaneously revealing and concealing the shadow's demands for expression. Absent mothers and marked daughters. The pattern Jung discovered. Jung identified one of psychology's most painful truths. The mother-daughter relationship determines how a woman relates to her own feminine nature for the rest of her life. When this foundational relationship is wounded, daughters often spend decades trying to heal through external means. Tattoos become attempts to mother themselves, to provide the nurturing care they never received. The pattern is disturbing in its consistency. Women who grew up with emotionally absent, critical, or overwhelmed mothers show remarkably similar tattooing behaviors. They seek the tattoo chair like they once sought maternal comfort, repeatedly, hopefully, always slightly disappointed by the temporary nature of the relief it provides. Jung understood that children don't just need physical care, they need psychological mirroring. The mother's role isn't just to feed and protect, but to reflect back the child's worth, to help them understand who they are through loving recognition. When mothers are too damaged, distracted, or depleted to provide this mirroring, daughters grow up with a fundamental uncertainty about their own value and identity. These unmothered daughters often describe their tattoos in maternal language without realizing it. They talk about nurturing their ink, about the tattoo taking care of some emotional need, about feeling held during the tattooing process. The tattoo artist becomes a temporary mother figure, paying focused attention to their body, creating something beautiful on their skin, giving them hours of undivided care. The timing of women's first tattoos often coincides with moments when the absence of proper mothering becomes most painful. 18th birthdays, when they're supposed to launch into independent adulthood but feel unprepared. After childbirth, when they realize they don't know how to mother because they were never properly mothered themselves. During relationship breakups, when they're forced to confront their inability to form secure attachments. Jung's research revealed how mother wounds create specific psychological patterns. Daughters of absent mothers often struggle with self-worth, leading to tattoos that attempt to create external validation of internal value. Daughters of critical mothers frequently choose tattoos as acts of rebellion, finally claiming autonomy over their own bodies. Daughters of emotionally unstable mothers often use tattoos to create a sense of permanent stability, something that can't abandon them like their mothers did. The content of these women's tattoos reveals the specific nature of their maternal wounds. Flower tattoos often represent the nurturing they wished they'd received. Tree tattoos symbolize the rootedness they never felt. Bird tattoos embody the freedom they couldn't safely claim in childhood. Angel or spiritual tattoos attempt to connect with the divine maternal they were denied in human form. But Jung would point out the tragic irony. These attempts at self-mothering through tattoos often recreate the original wound. Just as their mothers couldn't provide lasting security, the tattoo's temporary relief from emotional pain mirrors the inconsistent care they received. The daughter returns again and again to the tattoo chair, just as she once returned repeatedly to a mother who couldn't truly see or nurture her. The rise of matching tattoos among mothers and daughters represents a particularly complex phenomenon from Jung's perspective. On the surface, it might seem like bonding, but often it's the mother's unconscious attempt to control her daughter's individual expression, or the daughter's desperate attempt to finally win her mother's approval through shared body modification. Modern psychology has confirmed Jung's insights about intergenerational trauma transmission. Daughters unconsciously absorb their mother's unhealed wounds, often expressing them through the same self-destructive patterns. If the mother used external means to manage internal pain, the daughter likely will too. Tattoos become inherited coping mechanisms, passed down like genetic traits. The healing path Jung outlined requires daughters to consciously recognize how their mother wounds drive their tattooing compulsions. This doesn't mean blaming mothers, who are usually doing their best with their own inherited trauma. It means understanding that permanent ink can't fill the temporary hole left by inadequate mothering. Real healing requires grieving the mother they needed, but never had, then learning to provide that nurturing for themselves through internal rather than external means. The most heartbreaking aspect of this pattern is how it perpetuates across generations. Tattooed mothers, still seeking the healing they couldn't find through ink, often struggle to provide their own daughters with the present, attentive care that prevents the original wound from forming. The cycle continues, marked now not just by psychological scars, but by literal ones permanently etched in skin. The ink armor. How women protect themselves from the world. Jung recognized that humans develop psychological defenses to protect their vulnerable core from a harsh world. For many women, tattoos function as a sophisticated form of armor, not the metal kind that shields the body, but the symbolic kind that protects the psyche. This armor serves multiple functions. It controls how others perceive them, creates distance in relationships, and provides a false sense of strength when real strength feels impossible to develop. The heavily tattooed woman walking down the street is making a statement before she ever opens her mouth. Jung would recognize this as a brilliant psychological strategy. She's controlling the narrative of first impressions. Instead of risking rejection for who she really is, she presents a carefully crafted image that either attracts people who appreciate her aesthetic or repels those who don't. Either way, she maintains control over the interaction. This armor function becomes particularly clear when we examine how women's tattoo choices change after traumatic experiences. The woman who survives an abusive relationship often emerges with bold, aggressive tattoo imagery, skulls, weapons, predatory animals. These aren't just artistic choices, they're psychological warfare. The tattoos communicate to potential predators that she's no longer easy prey, while simultaneously reminding her of her own supposed strength. But Jung understood the double-edged nature of psychological defenses. While they protect us from real dangers, they also prevent genuine intimacy and connection. The tattooed armor that keeps predators away also keeps away people who might offer authentic love and support. The woman becomes trapped inside her own protective shell, safe but isolated. The placement of defensive tattoos reveals their protective function clearly. Neck tattoos create a barrier around the throat, the source of voice and vulnerability. Hand tattoos ensure that every interaction begins with acknowledgement of her marked status. Face tattoos represent the ultimate armor, completely controlling how the world responds to her presence before she ever reveals her personality. Consider how many women describe feeling invisible before getting tattoos and seen afterward. Jung would recognize this as a projection of internal worth onto external symbols. The tattoos don't actually make them more valuable or worthy of attention. They simply create an external focal point that distracts from the internal emptiness they're trying to fill. The armor becomes both shield and prison. The communal aspect of tattoo culture provides another layer of protection. By joining the tattooed community, women gain instant belonging with others who share their marked status. This tribal protection serves important psychological functions, but it can also prevent integration with broader society. The tattoo community becomes a safe haven where deeper healing work doesn't have to happen because everyone understands the shared pain that drives the marking behavior. Jung observed that effective armor must eventually be removed for genuine growth to occur. The psychological defenses that protect us in childhood often become limitations in adulthood. The woman who developed tattoo armor to survive a difficult adolescence might find that same armor preventing her from forming mature relationships or pursuing opportunities that require vulnerability. The addictive quality of tattoo armor becomes evident when women feel compelled to add more ink every time they feel vulnerable or threatened. Each new tattoo promises enhanced protection, greater strength, more complete armor. But Jung knew that external symbols of power often indicate internal powerlessness. The more armor required, the more vulnerable the person underneath feels. Society's changing attitudes toward tattoos have complicated their armor function. As tattoos become mainstream, they lose some of their protective power, forcing women to seek more extreme modifications to maintain the same psychological benefits. Larger pieces, more visible locations, more intense imagery. The arms race of self-protection escalates as society's tolerance increases. The tragic irony Jung would recognize is that the armor often attracts the very dangers it's meant to repel. The woman who tattoos herself to avoid being seen as weak might paradoxically attract people who are drawn to others with visible emotional defenses. The armor becomes a beacon for those who specialize in breaking down walls, defeating its protective purpose. Real strength, Jung argued, comes from integration rather than protection. The truly powerful person doesn't need armor because they've developed genuine resilience through facing and processing their vulnerabilities. They can afford to be open because they've done the internal work necessary to handle whatever responses they might receive. The armor becomes unnecessary when the person underneath is genuinely whole. The silent scream. Tattoos as emotional expression. In Jung's understanding of human psychology, symptoms always serve a purpose, even when that purpose remains hidden from conscious awareness. For many women, tattoos function as powerful expressions of emotional tension, attempts to communicate what cannot be said directly. The skin becomes a canvas for expressing what the voice cannot say, but tragically, most people looking at these artistic statements see only decoration. The phenomenon of transforming past emotional wounds into beautiful imagery reveals this function clearly. Old physical marks become elaborate flowers, symbolic designs, or uplifting phrases. Jung would recognize this as the psyche's attempt to transform pain into beauty, to make personal history more bearable and acceptable to others. But the original emotional experience may still remain underneath, longing for deeper recognition. Consider the placement of many women's tattoos in areas often associated with emotional vulnerability: wrists, inner arms, thighs. These locations aren't chosen randomly. They represent places where emotion has been held before, where the body has stored what the mind couldn't express. The tattoo needle returns to these familiar places, providing relief through transformation and creating permanent reminders of inner strength. The timing of tattoo appointments often correlates with emotional crises, though women rarely make this connection consciously. Jung would notice how many get inked during anniversaries of traumatic events, during depressive episodes, or when feeling overwhelmed by life circumstances. The tattoo session becomes a ritualized form of crisis intervention, providing structured pain and focused attention when internal pain feels unmanageable. The tattoo artist unknowingly becomes a confessor figure in these scenarios. Women often share deeply personal stories during long tattoo sessions, using the physical discomfort as permission to discuss emotional discomfort they normally keep hidden. The artist's focused attention and non-judgmental presence create a temporary therapeutic environment, but without the training to recognize or address the underlying issues being revealed. Jung understood that repetitive behaviors usually indicate unresolved psychological material-seeking expression. The woman who returns repeatedly for more tattoos isn't just collecting art. She's engaging in a compulsive pattern of seeking help through indirect means. Each session provides temporary relief from internal pressure, But because the root issues remain unaddressed, the compulsion continues. The content of these crying for help tattoos often contains obvious distress signals that go unrecognized by observers. Broken wings, wilted flowers, caged birds, storm clouds, bleeding hearts. The imagery screams emotional distress, but society has learned to interpret these symbols as artistic choices rather than psychological communications. The woman's cry for help hides in plain sight, unheard because it's expressed in a visual language most people aren't trained to read. Modern social media has amplified this phenomenon, creating platforms where women showcase their tattoos for validation and attention. Jung would recognize how these posts often function as indirect requests for support and understanding. The woman posting her new ink isn't just sharing art. She's hoping someone will see past the image to the pain it represents, will offer the help she cannot directly ask for. The medical establishment has largely ignored the psychological implications of tattoo addiction, treating it as a lifestyle choice rather than a potential symptom of underlying mental health issues. Jung would be disturbed by how society celebrates these silent screams as empowerment, missing crucial opportunities for intervention and healing. We've created a culture where women's cries for help are turned into fashion statements. The financial aspect adds another layer of tragedy to this phenomenon. Women often go into debt to fund their tattoo compulsions, prioritizing the temporary psychological relief over practical necessities. Jung would recognize this as evidence of how desperate the internal pain has become, when basic survival instincts are overridden by the need for symbolic expression of distress. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the SIM Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. The permanence of tattoos creates a particularly cruel aspect of this silent screaming. Unlike other forms of self-expression that can be changed when circumstances improve, tattoos lock women into representations of their worst moments. The cry for help becomes a permanent record, potentially triggering ongoing psychological distress long after the original crisis has passed. Recovery from using tattoos as silent screams requires learning to voice actual needs directly. Jung emphasized the importance of bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness, of finding words for experiences that have been expressed only through symbols. The healing begins when women can say out loud what their tattoos have been whispering through their skin, that they're in pain, that they need help, that they're worthy of care and attention without having to hurt themselves to receive it. The invisible prison, when art becomes self-destruction. Jung's most disturbing insight about human psychology was how we often imprison ourselves while believing we're gaining freedom. For countless women, tattoos represent the ultimate psychological trap. They choose permanent body modification thinking they're claiming autonomy, but actually create an invisible prison that becomes harder to escape with each passing year. The initial rush of getting tattooed feels like liberation. Finally, she's making a choice about her own body, expressing her individuality, claiming space in a world that has tried to make her invisible. Jung would recognize this euphoria as genuine. For a brief moment, the woman experiences authentic agency over her physical form. But like all psychological highs, this feeling fades, leaving behind only the permanent consequences of a temporary emotional state. The prison begins subtly. Career opportunities narrow as visible tattoos eliminate certain professional paths. Dating options shift as potential partners judge her based on first impressions rather than character. Family relationships strain as relatives struggle to understand her choices. Social interactions become filtered through the lens of her marked status. Slowly, the tattoos that were meant to expand her possibilities begin constraining them. Jung understood that true freedom requires the ability to change, grow, and adapt as life circumstances evolve. Tattoos create artificial limitations on this natural psychological development. The woman who tattoos inspirational quotes at 20 might find those same words painfully naive at 40, but they remain permanently etched on her skin. The relationship memorial tattoo becomes a constant reminder of a past she's trying to move beyond. The rebellious imagery that felt empowering in youth becomes professionally embarrassing in middle age. The removal process reveals the prison's true nature. Laser tattoo removal is painful, expensive, time-consuming, and often incomplete. Many women discover that escaping their inked past costs far more than creating it, both financially and physically. Jung would see this as the ultimate metaphor for how psychological patterns become self-perpetuating. What begins as a solution becomes the problem, but breaking free requires enormous effort and resources. The social prison aspect is particularly cruel. Once heavily tattooed, women often find themselves stereotyped and categorized by strangers who know nothing about their actual character or capabilities. They become walking billboards for assumptions about their lifestyle, values, and choices. The tattoos that were meant to express individuality actually force them into predetermined social categories, limiting how others perceive and interact with them. Jung would be fascinated by how modern culture celebrates this self-imprisonment as empowerment. Society encourages women to see permanent body modification as strength while ignoring the long-term psychological consequences. We've created a narrative where questioning tattoo choices is seen as judgmental, preventing honest discussion about their potential negative impacts on mental health and life trajectory. The economic prison emerges as women realize how much money they've invested in temporary emotional relief. Thousands of dollars spent on tattoos could have funded therapy, education, travel, or other experiences that promote genuine growth and healing. Instead, the money is literally under their skin, providing no ongoing value beyond the fading psychological comfort of the modification itself. The addiction aspect of tattoo collecting reveals another layer of imprisonment. Women who intended to get just one often find themselves compulsively returning for more ink, chasing the diminishing psychological returns of each new piece. Jung would recognize this pattern as typical of any addictive behavior. The need for increasingly frequent doses to achieve the same emotional impact, combined with inability to stop despite negative consequences. The dating and relationship prison affects women's ability to form genuine, intimate connections. Partners may be attracted initially to the edgy aesthetic but struggle later with the underlying psychological issues that drove the tattooing behavior. The artwork becomes a barrier to authentic intimacy, creating relationships based on image rather than substance. Women find themselves trapped between partners who fetishize their modifications and those who judge them negatively. The family prison extends across generations. Heavily tattooed mothers struggle with how to guide their own daughters regarding body modification choices. They can't honestly discourage tattoos without seeming hypocritical, yet they often recognize in hindsight that their own choices weren't entirely positive. The pattern risks repeating itself with each generation more extensively modified than the last. Jung would emphasize that recognizing the prison is the first step toward freedom. This doesn't necessarily mean removing all tattoos, but rather honestly acknowledging their limitations and psychological functions. Real liberation comes from developing internal resources for managing emotions, creating authentic self-expression through behavior rather than appearance, and building identity on character rather than aesthetic choices. The most tragic aspect of this invisible prison is how it prevents the very growth and healing that drove the original tattooing impulse. Women seeking transformation through external means often find themselves stuck in patterns that inhibit genuine psychological development. The permanent nature of tattoos creates resistance to the natural evolution of identity and values that characterizes healthy psychological maturation. Jung's revolutionary insights into the human psyche reveal uncomfortable truths about our modern tattoo epidemic among women. What society celebrates as art and empowerment often masks deeper wounds crying out for genuine healing. The needle becomes a false prophet, promising transformation while delivering only temporary relief from permanent pain. Perhaps the most courageous thing a woman can do isn't marking her skin with permanent ink, but facing the internal landscape that drives her to seek external solutions. The real question isn't what your tattoos say about you, it's what you're afraid to say without them.